A response to recent book of Abraham Apologetics by Dan Vogel.
Is the Book of Abraham proof that Joseph Smith was a fraud? Our critics certainly seem to think so. I mean, it's an open and shut case, right? They found the papyri and Joseph's notebooks, and the translation does not match, right? Well, a few months ago, my friend Hayden Carroll and I were digging into this topic and found some of the newest research. And to be honest, it blew our minds. This is a game changer. The bottom line is that the critics are simply wrong and demonstrably have been making some really bad assumptions about the documents and papyri for at least the last 50 years.
On the contrary, the critics have been right for 50 years because their conclusions were based on simple, straightforward observations. Unlike the apologists, who have been inventing some really bad ad hoc theories to escape this clear evidence of deception on Joseph Smith's part. It doesn't necessarily mean the Book of Abraham isn't inspired. That's a religious decision. But that belief should at least acknowledge Joseph Smith's willingness to use deception to convince others. That's the only honest way to explain the documents. The 50-year-old research of the critics, to which Hansen alludes, is a dialogue article by Gerald Tanner and Grant Heward titled The Source of the Book of Abraham Identified, published in 1968, shortly after the New York Metropolitan Museum transferred the papyri to the LDS Church. This research showed that the hieratic characters in the margins of the Book of Abraham documents were copied sequentially from the newly discovered papyrus known as the Book of Breathings of Hor, next to the original of Facsimile 1. This simple observation set off the apologists, like BYU professor Hugh Nibley, who tried to argue that the characters in the margins of the translation documents served other purposes than translation. He suggested that the characters were added later as mere decorations, or possibly an exotic way to match the same paragraphs in the 3 copies of the Book of Abraham. Nibley also began what apologists now call the reverse translation theory. They imagine that the scribes tried to reverse engineer what Joseph Smith had dictated by revelation.
It seems much more plausible in the historical record that what's going on here is that Joseph is assisting his friend W. Phelps in his pre-existing thing to try and see if they can take what he had received by revelation to try and reverse engineer the process.
But are the characters simply placed at the beginning of each paragraph? No, that's way too simplistic. One paragraph has a break mid-sentence to aid in lining up the text with the character. The characters were not added after the translation as an afterthought, but were integral to the translation. There is evidence that the characters were drawn first as the translation proceeded. Scribes Warren Parrish and Frederick G. Williams wrote simultaneously as Joseph Smith dictated. We know this because they made the same inline corrections, which are clear indications that one scribe didn't simply copy the other. The interesting part is that Warren Parrish stopped a few verses before Frederick G. Williams, but before doing so, he wrote the last character without a text, strongly suggesting that the characters were drawn as they proceeded through the translation process. Another indication that the characters were not added later is that it is obvious that the characters were not written by one person, but are different in both style and ink, similar to the English text, which is consistent with the probability that the characters were drawn as they went. Sadly, Hansen and Carroll didn't look much further than their fellow apologists on the internet. And it's not so new. The largest contributor dates to 2010. And I don't know how it blew their minds since it's some of the worst apologetics available. You'll soon see what I mean. As someone who has seriously studied what is sometimes called the Kirtland Egyptian papers, I will say that Nibley did not know them well. The apologists featured in Hansen and Carroll's video are not much better. This is unfortunate because there are LDS scholars who do know these materials, who have publications to which Hansen and Carroll could have learned a great deal. One of the major sources for learning about the documents is Robin Scott Jensen and Brian M. Hauglid's The Joseph Smith Papers, Revelations and Translations, Volume 4, Book of Abraham and Related Materials, published in 2018. An example of a more sophisticated approach to the Kirtland Egyptian papers is Brian Hauglid's 2020 article, Translating an Alphabet to the Book of Abraham, Joseph Smith's Study of the Egyptian Language and His Translation of the Book of Abraham, published in Producing Ancient Scripture. So, with this background information, let's see what Hansen and Carroll think is new information that is a game changer.
Here is Hayden with the details.
So recently, an ex-Mormon apologist named Colby Reddish went on multiple ex-Mormon channels to make it seem as though Jacob Hansen was being dishonest about the Book of Abraham during his conversation with Alex O'Connor.
I understand Colby's frustration with the apologists, but I wouldn't say Hansen was dishonest. Rather, he's too trusting of other apologists and too happy to repeat their really bad arguments. You will find on my YouTube channel a point-for-point response to what Hansen said about the Book of Abraham during his interview with Alex O'Connor.
But before we get into this topic, it's important to understand what documents we have and what documents we don't have. First of all, we do not have all of the papyri that Joseph Smith had. For some reason, critics simply ignore the fact that we know that some of the portion of the papyri Joseph Smith had was held in a Chicago museum that eventually burned down. Also, historians have looked at the descriptions of the papyri from eyewitnesses, and it seems clear that a good deal of what Joseph had is missing.
It doesn't matter what is missing, although we know a lot about what is missing, not from inaccurate descriptions from reminiscences, but from what we know about the Egyptian books of breathings and books of the dead, as well as from the fragments that were copied into 2 small notebooks. The important thing is that we have the source of the Book of Abraham, including Facsimile 1. The missing ending of the approximately 5-foot scroll containing the Book of Breathings for Hor or Horus, which included Facsimile 3, was about 2 feet long. This ended up in the Woods Museum in Chicago and was destroyed in the Great Fire of 1871. Joseph Smith represented the Hor Papyrus as the Book of Abraham, and to imply that the real record of Abraham was among the missing papyri is disingenuous.
And the earliest contemporary source describing the content of the acquisition comes from W. Phelps, who wrote a letter to his wife Sally in Missouri 3 weeks after Chandler arrived. Phelps wrote, "There were 2 papyrus rolls, besides some other ancient Egyptian writings with them. These papyrus rolls, according to Phelps, contain the records of Joseph and Abraham. Whether both were on the same scroll or one on each is not clearly specified by Phelps."
Barker is trying to suggest that the Book of Abraham and Book of Joseph were on the same scroll, and that scroll is missing. To prevent there being 3 scrolls, the Hor and Tasheret Min papyri would have to be joined together, which is ludicrous. Unless Barker thinks the fragments we have were always fragments, they weren't. The 2 rolls were glued onto thick paper and then cut into smaller pieces. So right away, Barker has lost credibility. He is attempting to take advantage of what appears to be an ambiguity in Phelps's description. However, Phelps's description implicitly states that the records of Joseph and Abraham were on different scrolls. The letter reads, "He soon knew what they were and said the rolls of papyrus contained the sacred record kept by Joseph in Pharaoh's court in Egypt and the teachings of Father Abraham." Phelps was describing the contents of both scrolls, not only one, 2 rolls and 2 authors. He clearly states that Joseph knew what they were, and they, the rolls of papyrus, contain the writings of Joseph and Abraham, both, not one. Barker is trying too hard to find a loophole so that he can make the Book of Abraham disappear. This is a totally disingenuous argument. Later, in 1843, Phelps was helping Willard Richards write Joseph Smith's official history when the following was written.
I, with W. Phelps and Oliver Cowdery as scribes, commenced the translation of some of the characters or hieroglyphics, and much to our joy found that one of the rolls contained the writings of Abraham, another the writings of Joseph of Egypt.
So right away, you can see what I mean by the worst apologetics.
In December 1835, Oliver Cowdery wrote to William Fry, similarly stating that there were 2 rolls of papyrus, with 2 or 3 other small pieces of papyrus, with astronomical calculations, epitaphs, etc., were found with others of the mummies. He also stated that the writings of Abraham and Joseph were beautifully written on papyrus with black and a small part red ink or paint in perfect preservation. Again, it isn't entirely clear whether both records were on the same scroll or on separate rolls of papyri. Based on these observations,
Barker is confused by Cowdery's imprecise wording when he changes from the plural to the singular. Near the beginning of his letter, he states, "Upon the subject of the Egyptian records, or rather the writings of Abraham and Joseph, I may say a few words." Here he uses the plural records, followed by writings of Abraham and Joseph, implying that the records of Joseph and Abraham involved both scrolls, and then switches to the singular. This record is beautifully written on papyrus with black and a small part red ink or paint in perfect preservation. He then returns to the plural. These records were obtained from one of the catacombs of Egypt. This is odd wording. Later in his letter, we find that Cowdery had borrowed some of the description from an affidavit Chandler obtained in Philadelphia, which states, "The papyrus, covered with black or red ink or paint, in excellent preservation, are very interesting." This is very close to Cowdery's wording. Note that this description mixes singular and plural. Papyrus are, as if they didn't know the plural for papyrus. So, in echoing the previous description, Cowdery retained the singular using the word record instead of papyrus. He also knew the rubrics, or red ink, appeared only in the record of Joseph, which he described in great detail. And we know by those details that he connected the record of Joseph with the Ta-Sheret Mem papyrus, not a missing scroll containing the book of Abraham and Joseph, as Barker wants us to believe. Cowdery goes on in his narration to make clear that the records of Abraham and Joseph were on separate scrolls. On opening the coffins, he discovered that in connection with 2 of the bodies were something rolled up with the same kind of linen, saturated with the same bitumen, which, when examined, proved to be 2 rolls of papyrus previously mentioned. Significantly, he had previously said nothing about 2 rolls, only the writings of Abraham and Joseph. Clearly, the writings of Abraham and Joseph were on separate scrolls. How could it be any other way? Cowdery associated the record of Joseph with the Ta-Sheret Mem papyrus, and the publication of Facsimiles 1 and 3 linked the record of Abraham with the Hor papyrus. Additionally, the characters in the margins of the Book of Abraham documents came from the Hor papyrus. Cowdery and Phelps said there were only 2 scrolls that came with the mummies, and we know what they were.
but Cowdery does state that Abraham and Joseph's writings included black and red ink.
Again, this is a disingenuous argument because Cowdery was describing the records of Joseph and Abraham generally, and we know Cowdery associated the record of Joseph with the Ta-Sheret Mem papyrus, not a lost book of Abraham and Joseph that Barker imagines. Nibley tried to use this argument 50 years ago, and it was debunked back then.
By 1842, some of the fragments of papyri were already preserved in a chest of drawers and framed in glass. Henry Caswell, an Anglican clergyman visiting Nauvoo, wrote, "Joseph proceeded to what appeared to be a small chest of drawers. From this he drew forth a number of glazed slides like picture frames containing sheets of papyrus with Egyptian inscriptions and hieroglyphics. In no uncertain terms, Caswell observed JSP 1, or Facsimile 1 in the Book of Abraham, as part of this collection of papyrus fragments framed in glass. Quote, pointing to the figure of a man lying on a table, he, Joseph, said, that is the picture of Abraham on the point of being sacrificed. The man standing by him with the drawn knife is an idolatrous priest of the Egyptians. Abraham prayed to God, who immediately unloosed his bands and delivered him, end quote. So no later than 1842, a number of papyrus fragments, either ends of rolls that were damaged and or some of the other papyri that Phelps and Cowdery referred to, were preserved in glass frames and cabinet drawers.
This is not in dispute. This is what was recovered from the New York Metropolitan Museum in 1967. What Joseph Smith framed were various fragments, as well as the damaged ends of the Hor and Tascheret Min papyri, which were glued to thick paper and then cut into smaller pieces and framed. However, Barker doesn't seem to understand that about 2 to 3 feet of the inner part of the approximately 4-inch wide Hor papyrus remained intact. The Tascheret Min papyrus may have been more than 9 feet long, minus the 3 feet of fragments recovered.
On February 19, 1843, Charlotte Haven wrote to her mother about her visit in Nauvoo and described her experience with the mummies and papyri, explaining that Lucy Mack Smith opened a long roll of papyrus on top of a long table, set her candlestick down, and explained that the roll contained the writings of Abraham and Isaac. Either Lucy or Charlotte probably meant Abraham and Joseph. Charlotte also mentioned seeing another roll of papyrus.
The other scroll was the Tascheret Min papyrus. Haven reported seeing a drawing of Mother Eve being tempted by the serpent, who, the serpent, was standing on the tip of his tail, which, with his 2 legs, formed a tripod and had his head in Eve's ear. The Tascheret Min fragments include a drawing of a walking snake near a woman, but the part about leaning back on his tail seems to be a conflation with the baboons adoring the sun, which can be seen randomly glued to one of the fragments and drawn on a separate sheet of paper. She may have seen a similar image elsewhere on the papyrus. The first scroll that Lucy rolled out on a long table, which, according to Haven's account, she said contained the writing of Abraham and Isaac, written in Hebrew and Sanskrit, was no doubt the 2 to 3 foot end of the intact Hor papyrus.
My purpose is to point out that there were 2 rolls of papyrus separate from the fragments of papyri that were preserved in glass frames. It seems that the fragments preserved under glass comprised a lot of papyri that were eventually sold to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1947, while the 2 rolls and some other fragments would eventually end up in Wood's Museum in Chicago and subsequently burned in the Great Chicago of 1871.
Barker is not clear or coherent, but his argument seems to be, since the entire Hor papyrus had been cut up and placed under glass before 1842, it could not be the long scroll containing the record of Abraham and Isaac mentioned by Haven in 1843. He doesn't seem to know that a 2 to 3 foot segment of the Hor scroll remained intact, and that it was no doubt among the Egyptian relics sold to Abel Combs in 1856, who immediately sold a portion of the collection to the St. Louis Museum, where they were placed on display. Later the same year, Gustav Seaforth, a visiting professor at nearby Concordia Seminary, described the contents of the Joseph Smith collection for the museum's catalog and found that the purported Abraham papyrus roll was not a record, as Joseph had claimed, but an invocation to the deity Osiris, in which occurs the name of the person, Horus, and a picture of the attendant spirits introducing the dead to the judge Osiris. Seaforth, no doubt, described Facsimile 3 of the Book of Abraham, which only survives through what Rittner described as a poorly rendered engraving. This roll was sold to the Woods Museum in Chicago, along with the other Egyptian relics, and destroyed in the fire of 1871.
Now, aside from this, we know from eyewitness accounts that the record of Abraham and Joseph contained black and red ink. Hor's document of breathings made by Isis has no rubrics or no red ink in any of its extant papyri fragments.
As previously mentioned, this is Nibley's old debunked Apologetic. Cowdery and 2 other sources never say that the Abraham scroll had red ink. All 3 gave a general description of both scrolls, but didn't say both had red ink. And Cowdery, we learned, was reflecting the language used by several Philadelphia men.
Those who claim we can be certain that we have all the papyri are simply ignoring this data and intentionally being misleading and overstating their case. It is simply a fact that we do not have all of the papyri Joseph Smith owned. What we do have are some of the papyri that Joseph Smith owned.
This is a disingenuous straw man argument. No one has claimed we have all the papyri. That's preposterous. Where are facsimiles 2 and 3? The valuable discovery notebooks tell us that the Amenhotep fragments of the Book of the Dead are also missing. So what Hayden argues is nonsense. We also know that 2 scrolls are missing. That is, the inner portions of the Hor and Tasheret Mem papyri, which Joseph Smith identified as the records of Joseph and Abraham. As I discussed, Professor Seyfarth examined the 2 to 3 foot scroll of Horus, which apparently went to the Woods Museum in Chicago and was destroyed in the fire. While Hayden wants to argue that since we do not have all the papyri Joseph Smith owned, there is a possibility that a real record of Abraham was lost in the Chicago fire. It's not a realistic possibility. We know what the 2 scrolls were, and they weren't the Book of Abraham. Barker's lost scroll theory was born out of desperation because Guy's long scroll theory is dead. His proposal that the Book of Abraham was attached to the end of the Hor papyrus can no longer be maintained. So Barker tries to save the lost scroll theory by attaching the ad hoc theory that the records of Abraham and Joseph were on one scroll, and the other scroll was either the Tasheret Min or Hor papyrus, or both. Barker is not clear about this. Regardless, upon close examination, Barker's missing scroll theory crashes and burns.
The other thing we have are known as the Kirtland Egyptian papers. Critics of the church just assume that these documents are Joseph's attempt to translate the papyri. But people who claim this have never actually dug into the Kirtland Egyptian papers.
Well, I have dug into the Kirtland Egyptian papers and even wrote a book about it. And I say they are Joseph Smith's attempt to document his translation of random characters from several papyri, as well as invented characters from the Adamic language. So it's not an assumption. The problem is that the apologists are simply incapable or unwilling to take the time to understand these documents and continually make false claims about them.
Before anyone makes claims about the Kirtland Egyptian papers, they need to ask themselves, what are these documents? And not simply assume that they were manuscripts of Joseph's translation of the Book of Abraham. The reality is that a close examination of the Kirtland Egyptian papers reveals some really fascinating things that most critics are totally unaware of. The following is a presentation given by the researcher William Schryver.
What are the Kirtland Egyptian papers?
Schryver's presentation was given 15 years ago and rarely discussed today. Many apologists are unaware of it. Schryver argues for what might be called the cipher theory. When it is mentioned, it is usually thrown out as a conversation stopper because those who use it don't really understand it. Those of us who know the sources well view it as somewhat of a joke. So it is surprising to me that Hansen and Carroll have revived it for their presentation here, but I'm willing to suffer through it if you are. Actually, since it's the longest presentation, I will shorten it. In fact, let me state up front what this theory involves and refute its premise now. Schryver wants us to believe that the hieratic characters in the margins of the Book of Abraham documents do not represent a translation, but an elaborate cipher or code for each of the paragraphs of the Book of Abraham. How does this make any sense? This is not how ciphers work. Ciphers are normally based on the alphabet and a system of substitutions to disguise the words. Schryver's cipher works for a specific paragraph and can't be used for anything else. That's not a cipher. Moreover, he can't tell us how it worked. The person on the other end decoding this cipher would need a Book of Abraham to decipher it. So why have a cipher? This makes absolutely no sense.
Now, there is one hugely important thing to keep in mind here. A single character can be used to encode entire paragraphs of text in these cipher keys that Phelps was making.
But you see, the substitution values for this cipher key are not going to be single letters, but rather entire words or even sentences and paragraphs.
This next part is really important. The best evidence against the Book of Abraham is the fact that among the Kirtland Egyptian papers, we have manuscripts of the Book of Abraham. And on the left-hand side of these are characters from the papyri. However, we can now see that at this time, Parrish, Phelps, and others were making various cipher keys related to Joseph's revelations using characters from the papyri. And Schryver makes a compelling case that these are exactly what the manuscripts were.
The fourth example of a pure language cipher key is the Abraham manuscripts authored by Frederick G. Williams and Warren Parrish. Just as the Egyptian alphabet cipher key divided the characters into parts and the explanations into degrees, so also the first line of these two manuscripts tells us that the characters that follow are designated as being from the second part of this particular cipher key, and their accompanying explanations are designated as being in the fifth degree.
Again, this is very important. Items in the fifth degree were parts where single characters were related to entire paragraphs.
Thus, the first cipher character has a substitution value of, I sought for mine appointment unto the priesthood according to the appointment of God unto the fathers concerning the seed. And the second cipher character has a substitution value of, my fathers having turned from their righteousness and from the holy commandments which the Lord their God had given unto them, unto the worshiping of the gods of the heathens. And it goes on with individual characters drawn from the papyri in the fashion John Gee has described, representing entire paragraphs from the text of the Book of Abraham.
This is why many have found it difficult to take Schryver's theory seriously. Need I say more? Schryver misunderstands the notation at the tops of the two translation documents dictated by Joseph Smith to Frederick G. Williams and Warren Parrish, which refer to the fifth degree of Part 2. This obviously refers to the alphabet and grammar. However, this presents a problem for Schryver's theory because Frederick G. Williams and Warren Parrish were not copying the text of Abraham, but rather writing as Joseph Smith dictated or translated. There are several examples, but we have already seen this one. You can see that both scribes wrote, their hearts are turned, then canceled it and continued on the same line with, they have turned their hearts. This shows that the correction was done immediately while Joseph Smith was dictating, and that he must have changed his wording mid-sentence. This necessarily dates the translation of Abraham chapter 1 verse 4 to chapter 2 verse 18 to after the 29th of October 1835, when Parrish was hired as a scribe. These documents likely date to the 19th and 20th of November. On the 19th of November, Parrish made an entry in Joseph Smith's journal. Went in company with Dr. Frederick G. Williams and my scribe, Warren Parrish, to see how the workmen prospered in finishing the house, that is, the temple. I returned home and spent the day in translating the Egyptian records. Another entry for the following day reads, spent the day in translating and made rapid progress. This contradicts Schryver's contention that the alphabets and grammar are ciphers based on an already translated Book of Abraham. The notation at the tops of these two documents is not a cipher, but rather a translation note. This character appears at the end of the Egyptian alphabet, part 1, and is defined as Zul, from any or some fixed period of time back to the beginning of the creation. It got expanded in the 5 degrees of part 1 of the grammar and probably relates to Abraham chapter 1, verse 3. The first 3 verses of Abraham appear in W. Phelps's handwriting, but there are only 3 characters. Evidently, this character was intended to be inserted next to verse 3. That verse reads, it was conferred upon me from the fathers, it came down from the fathers, from the beginning of time, yea, even from the beginning, or before the foundation of the earth, down to the present time, even the right of the firstborn, or the first man, who is Adam, or first father, through the fathers unto me. The note at the tops of the two documents was changed to second part, but that probably is a mistake since the second part gives the lineage of the high priests and has different characters. They probably intended the second degree of the first part instead of fifth part of the second degree. The definition of Zul in the second degree of the first part of the grammar reads Zul, from Abraham back to his father, and from Abraham's father back to his father, and so on back through the line of his progenitors. This definition fits Abraham 1 verse 3 the best and matches the character. It may also be related to Willard Richards' addition to the verse in his 1842 copy for the printer. You can see here that the phrase about the fathers was not in W. Phelps's copy, but was added by Richards. Joseph Smith and or Richards may have been alerted to this by the notation at the tops of the two translation documents. At any rate, the notation is not a cipher key. I could spend hours discussing Schryver's many mistakes, but I will spare my audience and myself. I think it's pretty clear that Schryver's cipher theory also crashes and burns.
Ever since Gerald Tanner analyzed the Kirtland Egyptian papers in the 1960s, the strongest argument against the Book of Abraham has been that the Book of Abraham manuscripts are in the handwriting of people like W. Phelps and Warren Parrish, because critics assume these are translations. And without the information we have gone over previously, you can see why that is. Here is the standard argument.
Okay, perfect. So if people can see that, they can see this character right here. This English text over here is the text of the Book of Abraham, like the text of the Book of Abraham as we have it today. So these are the original manuscripts. We have character matched with this character, character matched with this character. We can scroll down, character matched with this character, character matched with this character.
So he's pointing out that on the right, we have the Book of Abraham manuscript from the Kirtland Egyptian papers that Schryver was talking about in the previous videos. And on the left, he has the papyri. And he is correct that there is a character match between the papyri and these manuscripts, but he simply assumes that these must be translations without considering that Phelps and the others who wrote these very documents were doing in that time in the process of creating ciphers to encode entire paragraphs of text to a single character, and that they would use these characters from the papyri for that purpose.
This is total fantasy, Hayden. They were doing no such thing. Schryver's theory is total nonsense. That's not how ciphers work. The juxtaposition of the characters and the text of the Book of Abraham obviously represent a translation, and trying to say otherwise only makes you look desperate.
And if this sounds too convenient, consider this. Did you know that Joseph Smith explicitly commented on these very characters and said that the Lord had not given him a translation for them? I'm going to repeat that. The very characters Colby is talking about here are ones that Joseph Smith explicitly said the Lord had not given him a translation for. The papyri Colby is referring to is called JSP 11. Remember that. Tim Barker in 2020 did a deep dive on JSP 11 and Joseph's commentary about it in a presentation on this that critics simply ignore.
I certainly didn't ignore Barker's presentation. I responded to him at the time, online, and we had an exchange. So I will repeat my objections here. Okay, as I did with Schryver, I will state Barker's argument and refute it now. It begins with the observation made by Heward and Tanner in their 1968 article in Dialogue, specifically with this illustration showing a drawing from the Kirtland Egyptian papers of a damaged hypocephalus, and below that, how it appeared when it was published in the 1842 Times and Seasons as a woodcut created by Reuben Hedlock. Heward and Tanner discovered that the missing portions had been filled in by copying characters and images from other papyri. The main source for the characters turned out to be the Hor papyrus, so that the same characters used in the margins of the translation documents also appear in the restorations. So Barker wants to argue that since Joseph Smith in his explanations to Facsimile 2, declined to translate the characters that were copied from the Horror Papyrus, it means that he didn't translate the characters in the margins of the Book of Abraham documents 7 years earlier. One problem with this is that Barker assumes Joseph Smith knew where Headlock had taken the characters from. We don't know that. Another problem is that Joseph Smith didn't give translations to any characters, even those on the preserved portions of the Hypocephalus, and gave the same excuse for not doing so. No matter where the characters came from, Joseph Smith's comments would have been the same. Barker expects Joseph Smith to give a truthful answer while at the same time presenting a fraudulently restored hypocephalus. How can Joseph Smith's method of restoring the hypocephalus and then commenting on those restorations as if they were real be seen as anything other than a fraud? So, since Joseph Smith fraudulently presented the characters as part of the hypocephalus, what he says about them cannot be trusted. Citing fraudulent statements as evidence is obviously fallacious.
What we do have is commentary directly from Joseph Smith about JSP 11. I want to repeat that again. What we do have is direct commentary from Joseph Smith about JSP 11. And it was Tanner-Heward and Gerald Tanner who actually made this observation, but they stopped just short of its implications, just as every single one of their successors have done.
The truth is that no one, critic or apologist, has seen the implications of Joseph Smith's comments on Facsimile 2 quite the same as Barker. And there is a reason for that. It's silly, makes no sense, and makes Joseph Smith look bad.
Tanner-Heward wrote, "It is interesting to note that not only the manuscripts of the Book of Abraham, but also facsimile number 2 includes portions of this Book of Breathings. Evidently, the original of facsimile 2 is damaged. The missing areas on this drawing have been filled in with insertions from other documents to make facsimile 2 as it now exists." End quote. They're referring to a drawing from the Nauvoo Egyptian papers of a damaged hypocephalus. The actual hypocephalus was presumably burned in the Chicago fire as well. But this drawing, which clearly became facsimile number 2 in the Book of Abraham, has been preserved. Willard Richards probably drew the hypocephalus, since he wrote the explanations for the figures of this facsimile in the Nauvoo Egyptian papers. The lacunae for facsimile 2 did indeed come from other parts of the Joseph Smith papyri.
So what he's saying is that the original drawing of facsimile 2 had parts missing. So they decided to try to fill in the missing part using characters from JSP 11, the document Colby was referencing earlier, to fill in the gaps.
So, Hayden, you are okay with Joseph Smith filling the gaps in with material taken from another papyrus and not disclosing that to his readers? You're okay with that? He not only didn't disclose the falsification of this document, but he also pretended to know what the writing on the document said and declined to give a translation because it contained information that was too sacred or holy to reveal. Of course, we can read it now, and we know he was lying.
I've highlighted a third of the hypocephalus rim of figure 18, the right-hand side of the rim, and half of figures 13, 14, and 15 on the right-hand side as well. Just as Heward and Tanner depicted in their 1968 article. These highlighted portions can all be traced back to JSP 11. Starting with the rim, or figure 18, I've laid the semicircular text in a horizontal row. The text was inserted upside down, but when turned right side up and flipped around, the text can be aligned with hieratic text in JSP 11 from rows 2, 3, and 4. The text can be aligned with the hieratic text in JSP 11, once again, on row 4.
If they were indeed taking text that they believed was from the Book of Abraham, surely when Joseph explained the facsimile, he would have said that these portions were portions of the story of Abraham, right? Well, we'll see.
Are you serious, Hayden? Readers of the Times and Seasons were unaware that the original was damaged and had been filled in with characters from other papyri. Joseph Smith was perpetuating a fraud, and you expect him to reveal the source of the characters if they had been taken from the previous translation of the Book of Abraham, which was also a fraud? He didn't reveal anything about the source of any of the characters, so you can't take his silence or withholding of a translation as meaningful of anything.
So based on Heward and Tanner's theory, using our current versification, Abraham chapter 2 verse 1 through most of 2 verse 2, and half of chapter 2 verse 9 through all of chapter 2 verse 18 were all included in facsimile number 2. Fortunately, we know what Joseph had to say about this text since he provided the explanations to facsimile 2. Joseph's response is that the explanations will be given in the own due time of the Lord. And he concludes his explanations by saying, the above translation is given as far as we have any right to give at the present time. In other words, literally all of the JSP 11 hieratic characters included in facsimile 2, Joseph Smith deliberately declined from commenting upon because he believed that the translation would at some future time be given in the own due time of the Lord. Joseph clearly indicates that he did not translate JSP 11.
This is a laughable argument. It must be the most disingenuous and polemical argument I've ever heard from an apologist. As I've already mentioned, there are several problems with Barker's logic. First, we don't know Joseph Smith knew the source of the characters in Headlock's engraving. But even if he did, it doesn't matter since his statements were made in the furtherance of a fraud. Second, Joseph Smith didn't translate any of the Egyptian writing or characters on facsimile 2, not just the part taken from the Horror Papyrus. So that answer would have been the same even if different characters were used. He was pretending he was commenting on an undamaged hypocephalus, and we know he wasn't. Third, he implied that the characters contained sacred information, and therefore he couldn't give a translation, which shows he couldn't read Egyptian anyway. The writing that Joseph Smith said he couldn't translate at that time can be read by Egyptologists, and there is nothing so sacred or holy that had to be withheld. Fourth, it doesn't make much sense to use Joseph Smith's fraudulent restoration of facsimile 2 and refusal to translate any of the writing as a basis for arguing he never claimed to translate the characters on the Horror Papyrus that appear next to his translation of the Book of Abraham. For Barker to use this fraudulent restoration of the hypocephalus as evidence is purely polemical and, frankly, comical.
Did you get that? When Joseph Smith himself looks at those very characters Colby and other critics say are the Book of Abraham, Joseph says that he has not been given the translation of them.
No, Joseph Smith didn't say that. He implied that he knew the meaning of all the characters, but he wasn't allowed to reveal them. He said, contains writings that cannot be revealed unto the world, but is to be had in the holy temple of God. Ought not to be revealed at the present time also. Also, if the world can find out these numbers, so let it be. Amen. Will be given in the own due time of the Lord. The above translation is given as far as we have any right to give at the present time. Of course, none of this is confirmed when Egyptologists translate the same characters, just like when they translate the characters next to Joseph Smith's translation of the Book of Abraham. So he pretended to translate or to know the meanings of the characters, which contradicts the catalyst theory, by the way. But he was not able to reveal them. That's different than Barker's assertion that Joseph Smith didn't translate them. But this was all pretense because he was talking about characters that didn't belong on the hypocephalus. Therefore, it is unreasonable to rely on these comments as evidence for anything. Barker is simply dealing in polemics to escape evidence that challenges Joseph Smith's representations, rather than contributing to serious academic discourse. And like others before him, his apologetic also crashes and burns.
There is one more aspect to the Book of Abraham, and that's the facsimiles. So far, we have been talking about where the text of the Book of Abraham came from, but the facsimiles are doing something very different. The first thing to recognize is that the facsimiles are copies of drawings, not text. Here's what I mean. Imagine you found a page from a children's book where essentially all of the text was ripped away, but what was left was just the illustration page. Then someone came to you and asked, "What is the meaning of that drawing?" Do you see how this is different? Interpreting the meaning of a drawing is very different from interpreting the meaning of a particular text.
This is a false analogy because we don't just have the facsimiles. The facsimiles have writing on them. So it's wrong to talk about the facsimiles without talking about the writing.
Joseph Smith did give his interpretation of the drawings associated with the papyri, and while some of his interpretations do align with modern Egyptological understandings, most do not, and critics are quick to jump on this as proof that Joseph was a fraud.
So, Hayden, you have a problem with critics who see Joseph Smith's misses as evidence that he couldn't translate Egyptian, but it's okay for you to celebrate the few things he got right? Does that sound right to you? What if I told you the few times Joseph Smith was right? It was because he was probably influenced by his study of Hebrew or his study of the Bible. How impressed would you be then?
But this is not a new criticism, and recently, Dr. Kerry Muhlestein once again explained what the critics miss about the nature of the facsimiles. But before we get to his commentary, keep in mind that Dr. Muhlestein is an Egyptologist with many published books and articles on the subject, a director of archaeological digs, an expert in ancient Hebrew, and currently serves on the board of governors in one of the largest Egyptological organizations in the world. This is someone who knows what he's talking about.
Muhlestein is an Egyptologist who occasionally comments on the Kirtland Egyptian papers and early LDS history, but I find his understanding of these areas lacking and his interpretations misleading. I think I demonstrated that in a video response to his 2020 fair presentation on the Kirtland Egyptian papers. If the Egyptian characters next to the translation of the Book of Abraham represent an attempted translation, it really doesn't matter what parallels Muhlestein can find or what clever ways he can use Egyptology to extract Joseph Smith from difficult evidence. I'm not an Egyptologist, of course, but my concern with Muhlestein has less to do with Egyptology than with his willingness to distort things in favor of his religion. So I will focus my comments on the logic of his arguments and highlight places where I think he is acting more as an apologist than an Egyptologist. His main apologetic is to argue that Egyptologists can't say Joseph Smith was wrong about his interpretations of the facsimiles because nothing in Egyptology is known for certain. Even if Egyptology is not absolutely certain on every point, we do know enough about Egyptian iconography and funerary papyri to show that Joseph Smith's interpretations are not correct. It also attempts to shift the burden of proof and ignores the fact that there is a great deal of evidence against Joseph Smith's explanations. For example, in Facsimile 3, Smith identifies the figure labeled Osiris, clearly written in hieroglyphs, as Abraham sitting upon Pharaoh's throne. The hieroglyphic text directly contradicts Smith's explanation. Muhlestein wants to diffuse this evidence against Smith's interpretations by speculating about the possible existence of alternate interpretations held by nearby Jews. This is a fallacy of possible proof because it favors a mere possibility over the current best evidence provided by the labels. Another example on Facsimile 3 is where in the afterlife, Hor, who is being presented to Osiris by Matt and Anubis, is identified as Shulam, one of the king's principal waiters, as represented in the characters above his hand, which is completely wrong and begs the question, if Joseph Smith was wrong about the writing, why accept his interpretations of the drawings? So when you hear Muhlestein trying to diminish Egyptology's role in understanding this ordinary funerary text, know that he is attempting to use an argument from ignorance to bolster his flimsy speculations. This puts Muhlestein on the fringe of Egyptology as it pertains to the Book of Abraham. In fact, when it comes to the Book of Abraham, he is more of an apologist than an Egyptologist, meaning he is willing to sacrifice his discipline for his religion. He said as much when he addressed the apologetic organization FAIR in 2021.
So I'd like to be clear about my beginning assumption. I believe revelation is a valid source of knowledge. We should pursue things with our mind, but we should also pursue it with the part of our mind that listens to the Holy Ghost. And so I start out with an assumption that the Book of Abraham and the Book of Mormon and anything else we get from the restored gospel is true. Therefore, any evidence I find, I will try and fit into that paradigm. I don't feel that I need to defend that paradigm. I feel that I want to understand the evidence that I find within that paradigm, because to me it's a given that it's true.
So Muhlestein refuses to rein in his religious bias. He naively believes that since everyone has a bias, he doesn't have to strive for methodological neutrality. So what he says about Egyptology should be taken with caution.
How do you deal with these facsimiles? So it seems that some people think that these facsimiles they're disconfirming evidence of Joseph's prophethood. Do you have any insight on that as an Egyptologist?
Sure. Yeah, and this is a really common thing. I would say a lot of people, they hear these things online, and this is one of the frustrating things. Is you can get these little clips. To me, it reminds me of politics, right? Mm-hmm. In politics, it's so easy to give a 30-second half-true clip that's a great soundbite that everyone latches onto when truth is and issues are complicated, and people don't want to listen to the 5-minute explanation. They want the 30-second soundbite, even if it's not accurate, right? I just find the same arguments keep getting cycled around, even though they've been disproved. We've disproved them. We've shown what's wrong with them again and again and again and again, and they just keep going around because they're great 30-second sound bites.
Yeah.
Muhlestein might think he's answered the critics, but a lot of times he throws out nonsense apologetics. So some arguments get repeated because he didn't adequately answer the critics. His apologetic isn't as good as he thinks it is. But speaking of 30-second sound bites, here's one I keep correcting.
Look through all of the accounts, people who knew Joseph Smith and saw the papyri fragments and the rolls while he was alive and heard him or his mother talk about them. He had 2 rolls, one of them a long roll, and that's the one that Joseph and others refer to as the source of the Book of Abraham. That roll was destroyed in the Chicago fire. And what we can document is that he had already mounted some under glass before people were saying that he's translating from the long roll. So the fragments that we have, they're not what others were saying and what Joseph Smith was saying he was translating from. Anyone who tells you that Joseph Smith is translating from the text around Facsimile 1 on the small fragment that we have is just flying in the face of the historical accounts that tell us the source is the long scroll.
This is completely wrong. The sources say no such thing. None of them distinguishes between the fragments under the glass and the long roll. And no one says the published Book of Abraham came from the long roll, only that the long roll was the record of Abraham. Muhlestein evidently doesn't know that the fragments that Joseph Smith placed under glass was the beginning of the approximately 26-inch long, 4-inch wide Hor papyrus that was damaged and apparently broken off, and that approximately 2 feet of the Hor papyrus remained intact, which some people saw and described as the record of Abraham. This was no doubt the long roll. Charlotte Havens said Lucy Smith in 1843 rolled out on a table and said was the writings of Abraham and Isaac written in Hebrew and Sanskrit. Muhlestein published an article in the Journal of Mormon History in 2016 that is nothing but a poorly reasoned apologetic and a distortion of the sources. So even when he turns his 30-second soundbite into an article, he can't pull off the horrible apologetics.
So one of the basic arguments is, Joseph Smith says that these facsimiles should be understood and explained this way, and Egyptologists typically say they should be understood this way, right? There are, again, that's a nice 30-second soundbite. Here's the more complex history or understanding of how can you study these things. And it's never that simple. There are a whole bunch of hidden assumptions within just saying that, all right? So one of them is that Egyptologists can accurately tell you what those pictures mean. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of the difficulty with that as an Egyptologist, and I'm talking about our own limitations, and a good scholar will recognize and be upfront both about their limitations and about the lens they bring with them, and the fact that they can't be fully objective. They bring a lens with them. All right, so we do have limitations. These drawings, at least the ones that we still currently have, and the ones we can get a decent date on all three of the facsimiles, and they're from roughly 200 BC. All right. Most of the drawings that we have good information or good evidence on are from much earlier than that. And we can say much earlier, they would interpret this way, they would interpret this way. And even then we know we're saying, well, most of the time in these situations, you're always on shaky ground if you start to ever say always. I just said that, right? You're always on your hand. Anyway, okay. Caught myself. But anyway, you just know there are going to be exceptions in Egyptology. So, but you also know that if they interpret a certain figure or a drawing or something like that in 1250 BC, they're going to interpret it differently in 200 BC. I mean, there's no doubt that's going to happen, but we often just keep giving the answers we know from this time period and putting them on top of this time period. That's kind of shaky ground anyway.
This is an example of the misuse of principle. In this case, taking a generally true principle like interpretations change over time, and then, without proof, applying it to the Hor papyrus drawings. Muhlestein's argument also commits the fallacy of possible proof, because he merely raises the possibility that the interpretation of the drawings has changed over time. Legitimate scholarly discourse requires a degree of probability, not just possibility. Besides, Muhlestein ignores the fact that these drawings are labeled, providing both context and interpretation.
So just to clarify, the same image or the same Egyptian figure could be seen, it could be interpreted one way in this time period, and the people understand it a different way in this time period.
Yes.
And this is
even you see a drawing of a person that you'll say, okay, that person has to be this figure. And then you find out, oh, well, actually in this setting, it's a different figure that looks the same. And in this setting, it's a different figure that looks the same. That happens to Egyptologists all the time.
Now, how is it that Egyptologists know the figure means something different in a different setting? They have to have a good reason that Muhlestein is leaving out. But what is his reason for defending Joseph Smith changing these characters from Osiris to Abraham, from Anubis to a slave, from Isis to Pharaoh, from Hor to Shulam? Again, Muhlestein is using a true principle. The Egyptians sometimes give different names to the same figure and misapplying it to the Hor papyrus. The papyrus does not support Joseph Smith's changes. I think Muhlestein is trying to gaslight us.
Well, I think it's because it's Egyptian. Sometimes people, because we're so unfamiliar with it, we just kind of give up all of our critical thinking and just like, oh, like when you remember that these are pictures, if you showed someone 2,000 years ago or 500 years ago a political cartoon from today with no text, who knows what meaning they would come up with.
That's exactly right.
Why do you guys keep saying there's no text? There is a text. Facsimile 1 has 5 columns of text. Facsimile 2 has text all over it and around it. Facsimile 3 has writing underneath and labels for each of the figures.
And you also have to remember that when you're talking about Egyptology, you're talking about a 3,000 year plus period of time. Obviously, things change over 3,000 years, right?
Yeah.
If interpretations of the facsimiles had changed as you suggest, why is Facsimile 3 labeled just as Egyptologists would expect?
As one specific example, the kind of drawing that Facsimile 2 is, we call it a hypocephalus. And the different characters in there, and what by characters, I don't mean the writing, but the figures, the people-looking characters, or the cow, or whatever. Sure. Even among Egyptologists, there were a couple of different camps, like, no, this is this, no, this is this, and there was some disagreement. But we couldn't say for sure because they weren't labeled.
Disagreement among experts isn't evidence for Joseph Smith's interpretations. Even when Egyptologists have been wrong, it doesn't mean Joseph Smith could be right.
Then my colleague, so this is an LDS Egyptologist, but a very good one, John Gee, he found an example of one where a number of those characters they had labeled. And it turns out that we were mostly wrong. Both camps were mostly wrong.
Yeah.
But people had been saying for a long time, see, Egyptologists say it means this, and Joseph Smith says it means something different, so he must be wrong, when the Egyptologists are now demonstrably wrong on those things.
Interesting.
Right? Yeah. So that's the thing we have to be careful of, is saying, okay, we know what Egyptologists can tell us what an ancient Egyptian would have seen in this.
And there you have it, a textbook example of an argument from ignorance. Egyptologists were wrong in the past, therefore they could be wrong now, implying that Joseph Smith could be right. Of course, Mormons don't think Joseph Smith could be right, but he is right. This is the well-worn path of pseudoscientists. It is also a false dichotomy because both could be wrong. However, the assertion that the Egyptologists were wrong about something doesn't mean they are wrong now. One could dismiss anything with that logic. In the example Muhlestein gives, Egyptologists were wrong because there were no labels, and they gave their best interpretation, which I'm sure they were careful to qualify. Muhlestein is sure to tell us that both camps of Egyptologists were wrong, but doesn't tell us that Joseph Smith was also wrong. There's little hope that Egyptologists will ever discover a text describing Kolob next to God's throne, or belief in 15 governing fixed stars or planets, 3 of which were grand ruling planets, an obvious reflection of the recent expansion of his priesthood hierarchy of 12 apostles and a first presidency. The system of astronomy explicated by Joseph Smith is similar to that of the 19th century natural theologians, who believed there were systems within systems moving around a grand center where God dwelt. This explains why Joseph Smith could describe the sun as both a fixed star and a moving planet. It makes more sense that Joseph Smith interpreted the drawings according to his knowledge of Hebrew, the Bible, and the science of his day, rather than an ancient priest named Hor mixing Egyptian and Jewish lore, which is not supported by the text on the papyrus.
Yeah. Right. That's what most people are saying. They say Egyptologists say it means something different, but what they mean is, well, the ancient Egyptians would have seen it this way. And there aren't any ancient Egyptians to ask. We go to Egyptologists, and that's already a disconnect. But the other problem is, we don't know, is Joseph Smith telling us how all ancient Egyptians would have seen this? Is he telling us how ancient Jews would have reinterpreted Egyptian drawings? Because we know they did. Yeah, we have lots of examples of them taking stories and drawings, things like that, and interpreting them differently. So I'll come back to that in a little while. We also have to say maybe he was giving us what a specific set of ancient Egyptians would have seen in this. So I'll come back to that in a second. Or he may have just been saying, this is what we need to get out of it, regardless of what ancient Egyptians would have seen out of it, right?
Yeah.
Do you not see the desperation in this? There's only one option that Muhlestein left out. Joseph Smith couldn't translate Egyptian, but the last possibility he gave is probably close to the truth. Joseph Smith used these facsimiles, as well as his translation of the last 3 chapters of the Book of Abraham, to give his ideas, which he may have felt were inspired, the air of ancient authority. In other words, Joseph Smith may have seen himself somewhat as an inspired pseudepigraphist. While the Kirtland era material seemed preoccupied with lending support for an ancient lineage of high priests and the authority of that priesthood to preside over a patriarchal government, such as the one Joseph Smith was trying to establish in Missouri, the Nauvoo material was concerned more with theosis, or human deification, and legitimizing his temple endowment. For Muhlestein to suggest that Joseph Smith may have just been saying that this is what we need to get out of it, regardless of what the ancient Egyptians would have seen, tells us that he isn't really committed to some of his answers, and that he will say anything to protect his religion. For those who want to believe Joseph Smith could translate Egyptian, ask yourselves, if Joseph Smith was wrong about the writing on Facsimile 2, as I have previously discussed, and he was also wrong about the labels on Facsimile 3, how accurate could his interpretations of the drawings be?
We're making a lot of assumptions about what Joseph Smith is doing, and then saying, okay, now we've absolutely proved that he's wrong. based on our assumptions that may, in some cases, are demonstrably wrong, and in some cases, we don't know if they're right or wrong. Right?
Here again, Muhlestein makes an appeal to possibility. But when Joseph Smith tells us what certain characters on the facsimile say and he's wrong, that's not an assumption. That's evidence that he couldn't translate Egyptian. That evidence weighs more than Muhlestein's speculations about how some group of Jews might have interpreted the drawings.
So just as an example, we do know that around 200 BC, which is when these papyri were created, around 200 BC, there were priests in Thebes, and this was one of these sets of, well, both sets of papyri that we still currently have were owned by a priest or a priestess in Thebes, that they were collecting stories from Greece, from Jews, and from other places as well, but those are the two largest non-Egyptian populations in Egypt at the time, are Greeks and Jews. They were collecting those stories and incorporating them into their own religious beliefs and practices. Right? So, for example, we can find spells of, if you want to know the name of God, or you want to call God down to visit you on a high mountain, you become Moses. And we know they were incorporating Abraham. We can demonstrate they were using Abraham in their videos. So is Joseph Smith maybe telling us what this specific Egyptian priest, what he would have seen in this as he mixes Egyptian and Jewish practices together in the same rituals and texts, which we know they were doing?
It's a true principle that myths are often adapted and changed when cultures mix. But can Muhlestein demonstrate that from the Hor papyrus? Where is the mixture of the Egyptian religion and Judaism? You can't just assert a possibility that someone might look at the drawing and see something different than what the text says. That's the fallacy of possible proof. It's also an unnecessary hypothesis because you don't have to go back to 200 BC to find someone interpreting Egyptian iconography through a Hebrew Jewish lens. That's what Joseph Smith did. He even used Hebrew words in his interpretations.
This is very important to keep in mind. The Egyptians were mixing Jewish iconology and ideas into their own religion during the time period these facsimiles come from. So let's imagine there was a group of Christians in ancient India who began using Hindu icons to represent Christian stories. Let's just say that you saw a drawing of Vishnu walking on the water next to a boat with 12 cows in it. An expert would say that's Vishnu, and they would be right. But if this image was produced by a group of Hindus who were known to mix Christian and Hindu symbols and stories, you can see how this could also be interpreted as Jesus walking on the water. It's important to remember that we know that Egyptians would mix Jewish and Egyptian traditions together, including stories about Moses and Abraham.
How can this be an analogy? Where in the facsimiles is there something like walking on the water? Is there anything that is distinctly Jewish in the facsimiles?
So we know that the priest who owned, there's an ancient Egyptian priest, 200 BC.
Yeah, his name is Hor.
His name is Hor, and he lived, where do you say, Thebes?
In Thebes. He's a priest in Karnak, a priest for Amun-Ra, for Min, and for Khonsu.
And we know that this group in this area, people were collecting Judaic tradition and stories. And so,
and there was a sizable population of Jews in Thebes at the time.
And so if the Book of Abraham is what we understand it to be, a person like Hor is exactly the person we would expect to own it.
Exactly who you would expect to own it. That's right. Exactly who you'd expect to own it.
And all of that information, that's not from the Book of Abraham, in English that we read. That's all from the papyri, correct?
Well, no, that's from lots of Egyptological sources.
I see. So about Thebes and everything.
Yeah.
But then identifying the owner of the
That's
papyri.
from the actual papyri. Okay. Yeah, identifying the owner is from the papyri, yes.
So when questioned, Muhlestein admits that he is speculating that Hor, an Egyptian priest, would be the type of person who would mix Jewish and Egyptian stories, but that this information isn't corroborated in the Book of Breathings that he was buried with. In fact, Hor's Book of Breathings would be a challenge to Abraham's monotheism. So it might be an exaggeration to claim Hor, a pagan priest, would have been just the person to own a Book of Abraham. Later, Muhlestein seems to retract this statement.
And Hor was the most, Hor was the guy who owned this copy of it.
Well, I don't know if he owned a copy of the Book of Abraham. We'll come back to that in a minute. But he at least owns the papyrus fragments that we still have.
I see.
That has, and the original, that facsimile one is a facsimile of, he owns that.
Okay.
So Hor owns a book of breathings, but not the book of Abraham? I thought they were on the same scroll. Or do you think there were 3 scrolls?
Let's go back to how people might interpret these drawings, right? Because that's again the claim. Well, Joseph Smith says they mean this, but Egyptologists say they mean this, so it can't be. So we'll just use as an example facsimile 3, which has a person seated on a throne, and typically you'd look at that drawing as an Egyptologist and say, "Oh, that's Osiris," right? And you find lots of what we call stelae and also papyri. Stelae are stone, like kind of round top stone texts, basically, and you find lots of them showing Osiris on that throne. But actually, you find a number of them who say it's Abraham or Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob on the throne. Mm-hmm. So people who say, "Oh, that you would never, that can't be Osiris," even if it's labeled in this case Osiris or whatever, if we know there were people from that time period who were interpreting it as Abraham. So anyone who says that can't be Abraham, it's Osiris, they're just wrong, because the Egyptians sometimes said it was Abraham. Yeah, we have examples of it. We know that's the case. So when he says this, that's incorrect. That it couldn't be that way Egyptologically. It's just factually wrong. It could be that way.
Yeah. It doesn't matter what other obscure books or steles say. This facsimile has writing on it that Joseph Smith pretended to read. He didn't just misidentify Osiris, but also the 4 additional figures. Anubis is Olimla, a slave belonging to the prince, probably because he is depicted as black. That has Joseph Smith's culture written all over it. The printing plate for facsimile 3 seems to have been altered to remove Anubis's snout, another falsification of the papyri. Hor, who is being presented to Osiris, is misidentified as Shulam, one of the king's principal waiters, as represented by the characters above his hand, which is incorrect. If these identifications are wrong, how confident can we be about Joseph Smith's interpretations of any of the drawings?
In fact, the Savior himself took and we have this in the New Testament, he takes an Egyptian story where someone, after they die, is in the bosom of Osiris, but he changes it to the story of it's a poor person and a rich person story in the afterlife, and the rich person is suffering, and the poor person is in the bosom of Osiris. When the Savior gives that as a parable, he calls it Lazarus, and he's in the bosom of Abraham. He just, like Egyptians, that seems to be the equivalent. You switch Abraham and Osiris. Jews and others were doing that, right?
I fail to see how an instance of the New Testament adapting an Egyptian story by swapping Osiris with Abraham is relevant to facsimile 3. For all I know, they adapted Osiris's resurrection as well. None of this helps us understand the Hor papyrus on its own.
We can find associations of facsimile 2 with Abraham. We can find associations of facsimile 3 and 1 with Abraham. All of them, at one point or another, are in some way associated with Abraham by Egyptians. And just that. I mean, just think, what are the odds of that? Yeah. That Joseph Smith finds 3 Egyptian drawings, says that these are associated with Abraham, and we find out that those kinds of drawings actually are associated with Abraham. Your odds of guessing that well are really, really low. I think it takes more faith to disbelieve Joseph Smith is right than to believe he's right on that one. For sure.
Muhlestein is trying to make apologetic points, but it's hardly relevant since Abraham's name is nowhere to be found on the Hor papyrus or the Shoshank hypocephalus. But I think the odds would be fairly good for the apologists finding what they need, considering Abraham's prominence and the cultural exchange that occurred in Upper Egypt. At the same time, I think the odds are much lower that the vignettes on the Tasheret Min papyrus could be associated with ancient Joseph, but I could be wrong. I would imagine that the link to these 2 patriarchs, whose stories are so prominently tied to Egypt, would be as tempting for ancient Egyptians as they were to Joseph Smith. Besides the prophet Moses, what other patriarchs could Joseph Smith assign his 2 papyri? Additionally, In these obscure instances where Abraham is associated with these vignettes, it doesn't sound like they were exclusively associated with Abraham, or that Abraham was exclusively associated with just these 3 vignettes. We also need to be wary of Muhlestein's use of the term associated. In what way were they associated? There are no footnotes to check, even in the small book he published in 2022, where he made the same claim. He gave no sources. Muhlestein has been known to exaggerate the significance of this association to Abraham. For years, Guy and Muhlestein touted the Leiden Papyrus as an instance where Abraham was represented on the lion couch. This turned out to be totally false. The Leiden Papyrus is a Greek codex dating to about the end of the 3rd century CE, in which Abraham's name appears in a long list of names in the attached spell, but has no direct relevance to the drawing. So when Muhlestein says he will try to make the data fit his religious paradigm, take him at his word. Since we don't have footnotes to check and he doesn't cite any sources, his comments should be taken with caution. Not that it matters, since the Hor Papyrus doesn't mention Abraham, although Joseph Smith said it did. In 1840, he even pointed to a character on one of the fragments under the glass and said it was the signature of the patriarch Abraham. It seems likely that the character he identified was the one in column 2 next to facsimile 1, which in the Egyptian alphabet he had designated as Chi Abram. So it doesn't matter that the apologists can find obscure sources that associate Abraham with the facsimiles. Where is the evidence for connecting the Hor Papyrus and Shoshank Hypocephalus with Abraham? Muhlestein's speculations about how some Egyptians may have interpreted the vignettes, despite what they actually say, have less historical weight than Joseph Smith's mistranslations and incorrect identifications. So it doesn't matter that the apologists can find obscure sources that associate Abraham with the facsimiles. Where is the evidence connecting the Hor Papyrus and Shoshank Hypocephalus with Abraham? Muhlestein's speculations about how some Egyptians may have seen or interpreted the vignettes, despite what they actually say, have less historical weight or significance than Joseph Smith's mistranslations and incorrect identifications.
And there are lots of examples of that. And we could tell you all sorts of things like, we won't go into all the details, but I could show you example after example where, well, actually, this element of the facsimile that Joseph Smith says it represents this, I can find an Egyptological example of it. Not every element. My guess would be, give us enough time to study, and we will find every element. But whether it be the names of the gods underneath the altar.
Well, since Joseph Smith gave the wrong names for the 4 sons of Horus, the apologists want to go on a hunting expedition through antiquity to find any similar name. In a 2020 article in the Interpreter, John Gee searched over 2,000 names of ancient gods to find anything similar to the names Joseph Smith gave. These were mostly 3-consonant names. Ancient Semitic and cuneiform names have no vowels. Gee called them tentative identifications. Here are the names of the 4 sons of Horus compared to the names Joseph Smith gave. Joseph Smith gave Elkanah, Libnah, Mamacra, and Korash. Now let's look at Gee's proposed identifications. The parentheses show the Hebrew, Hittite, and Ugaritic forms. Note that Gee's proposal for Elkanah ends with RS. His proposal for Libnah and Korash have the same consonants, but different pronunciations. For Malmacra, Gee could only find a listing for MKR rather than MMKR. From a skeptical point of view, it seems probable that 3 of the names were influenced by the Bible account of the exodus of Israel from Egypt. 2 similar names can be found in the same verse. I think the name Elkanah is an obvious clue, a connection that seems strengthened by Korah in the same verse. I have to wonder if Joseph Smith's alteration of Korah to Koresh was influenced by his knowledge that the Persian proper noun for king was shortened to Koresh and used in the Hebrew Bible to refer to Cyrus the Great, the Persian king who conquered Babylon and allowed the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem. This information was readily available in the Bible literature of his day. Libna is an exact match, but it's difficult to determine how Joseph Smith came up with Malmacra. It's similar to a nonsensical name he invented for one of the 15 moving planets, Crash Macra. So it may have been something that tickled Joseph Smith's brain. I must confess, when it comes to rummaging around the ancient world for names, whether for the Book of Mormon, Book of Moses, or Book of Abraham, I'm not impressed with this kind of evidence.
Whether it be that this crocodile is associated with Pharaoh.
The association of Pharaoh with a crocodile was known in Joseph Smith's day through the Bible and Bible commentaries. Clark's commentary, for example, under Job 41:34 states, "The kings of Egypt were called Pharaoh, which signifies a crocodile."
Astronomy is one you've talked about before.
Exactly right. I mean,
Josephus famously said Abraham taught the Egyptians astronomy. Josephus was well known in Joseph Smith's day. Oliver Cowdery even quoted Josephus in December 1835 in the Messenger and Advocate.
There are so many things that line up that anybody who tells you, no, these drawings cannot mean this, doesn't know the facts, right?
I think those who do not accept the premise that the facsimiles can be divorced from the surrounding text will conclude that Joseph Smith was wrong most of the time, and that the few things he got right or nearly right were either coincidences, accidents resulting from his application of similar Bible imagery, or readily available sources like Josephus. There are also instances where apologists exaggerate or manipulate to get things to look more similar. The apologists' explanations for the facsimile rest entirely on the long scroll theory, which posits that the Book of Abraham followed Hor's Book of Breathings on the same scroll. This theory was debunked in 2010 by researchers Andrew W. Cook and Christopher C. Smith, who estimated the length of the missing papyrus by measuring the diminishing distance between the repeated patterns of damage along the top edge of the remaining fragments of the Hor scroll. Since these fragments were taken from the outer wines of the scroll when rolled up, it could be determined how many possible wines were left. They concluded that the missing interior section was about 56 centimeters, or about 22 inches long. This is consistent with the expected length of about 5 feet. Without the long scroll theory, it makes no sense to interpret the facsimiles in a way that doesn't fit their Egyptian Osirian context.
Now, I'm not going to, the earlier Egyptologists that in 1912, they asked about these. I'm not going to blame them. They were looking, Egyptology is still a new field. They were looking at the generalities. Mm-hmm. It's only as we go in and look for these specific things that we say, oh, look, this does happen.
Well, something I remember you saying was that one of your favorite textbooks on Egyptology, you can no longer use it.
Yeah.
It was only published, how many years ago?
So it was published when I was an undergrad in college. So that's now like 30 years ago.
And it's in a sense obsolete now.
Yeah. And that's true. I mean, you never get a textbook that's 10 years old because all textbooks that are 10 years old have wrong information in them. Now, I'm saying textbooks. I'm not saying like, if you get a copy of War and Peace, it's going to be the same, right?
Yeah.
But a textbook has wrong information in it if it's very old, because we keep finding out that what we thought we knew, we actually didn't know. But people lose their testimonies over what we thought we knew.
Muhlestein implies that Egyptology is slowly catching up to Joseph Smith. This is incorrect. The assessment of the Egyptologists has not radically changed since 1912, when they were examined by several prominent Egyptologists. What changed since that time was the discovery of some of the papyri in 1967. This told us that the characters next to Joseph Smith's translation of the Book of Abraham were taken sequentially from the Hor papyrus. We could also see that the non-Egyptian characters coincided exactly with the gaps in the papyrus. Since that time, apologists have invented one failed theory after another to save Joseph Smith from this devastating evidence. It should be noted that most of what Muhlestein has argued has nothing to do with the papyri themselves, but with things outside these documents. Speculations about how an ancient Jew living in Egypt might interpret the facsimiles, despite what they actually say. Muhlstein's Apologetic, despite his appeals to Egyptology, therefore crashes and burns, just like all the rest.
Now, as you have seen today, the Book of Abraham is a complex topic. Critics who pretend they know exactly what the Kirtland Egyptian papers are, or who act as if there is only one way to interpret the illustrations from the papyri, are just wrong.
Hayden, I don't think anyone has claimed to know exactly how the Kirtland Egyptian papers worked, but we understand them well enough, that is, those of us who have studied them, to know Joseph Smith couldn't translate Egyptian. Guy's long scroll theory has been proven wrong. Barker's polemic about the missing scroll is wrong, as well as his claim that Joseph Smith didn't consider the Hor Papyrus as the source of the Book of Abraham. Schryver's cipher theory is laughably wrong, and Muhlstein's speculations about the facsimiles are irrelevant.
The reality is that there are still a lot of questions out there about the Book of Abraham. Were these papyri just a catalyst for revelation about Abraham? Is there a scroll that was burned in the Chicago fire that contained the source for the Book of Abraham? The fact is, we just don't know for sure. And I think it's the unresolved nature of these kinds of questions that often lead people to concerns about this topic. I hope that today you walk away realizing that so many of our critics are just not up to date on the latest research.
Hayden, is this your takeaway? We don't know anything for sure, but the critics are not up to date on the latest research? This isn't the latest research on the papyri and the Book of Abraham. It's the latest apologetic. There's a difference. There is better research you could have used. The apologists that you have chosen to highlight are not scholars of the Book of Abraham and related documents. They are polemicists concerned only with protecting a traditional and fundamentalist view of Joseph Smith and Revelation. You may have to become more nuanced in your defense of the faith. I'm Dan Vogel. As always, thanks for watching and have a good day.